difficult and complicated system to understand, we have to simplify down into manageable chunks and easy systems for us to remember. One of these systems is going to be proportion. Proportion essentially deals with how large different parts of the body is. How long are the legs compared to the torso? How large is the skull? How large are the arms? And so on. There is, of course, an insane amount of variation between people, but it's still really useful to look into and understand generic proportions of the figure. If you know, for instance, that your figure is 5 heads tall, most likely you have to change that because you have proportional rules basically indicating that a figure is between 7 and 8 heads tall. There are a lot of different proportional systems out there, but the one we're going to be using is based around heads. It's difficult to find something that's both correct and also easy enough to understand. A more correct system of proportion is going to be using 7.5 heads as the average, but to make that system work, you have to add a lot of complexity to it, which simply means it's harder to learn. Anything that adds complexity while learning anatomy, I generally find to be avoided, just because the whole task is so daunting. So instead of 7.5 heads, we are going to be using 8 heads. That is a dividable number, and it's fairly easy to understand, and it really proves to be quite handy. Now, of course, since there is so much natural variation between people, I highly recommend that whenever you're making your own art, if it's drawing or sculpture or anything else, that you use real-world reference for the proportion. You shouldn't simply align the character up to 8 heads and then just draw from there. Having real-world reference is going to be really important because there is just a lot of variation between people. For instance, the taller you get, the more heads you'll be in terms of proportion. And the shorter you are, the fewer heads you're going to be. If you're creating a short person, that person is more likely to be 7 heads. If you're creating a real tall one, they're more likely to be 8 heads. Now, a last point before we get into the actual practicals of it. When we're talking about proportion, we are technically talking about like the ratio between different parts here, like how large are different pieces and such. But in practice, we are really just talking about the bones. We're talking essentially about the length of the bones. So when we're talking about the legs, we're really just talking about the length of the bones of the legs. If you're talking about the arms, we're talking about the length of the bones of the arms. So this becomes pretty important. We're going to be talking more about this later on. But by far, the biggest building block you have when you're dealing with proportion is going to be the bone. So just keep that in mind in general. Bones really do determine the proportions. So let's get into the actual proportions now. So if we split the figure in 2, now you can see that we are bang on in the middle. And this is basically where the groin is, as well as where the hands are going to be. I find this to be a very, very useful landmark because it's really easy to make the torso too long or to make the legs, well, in that case, too short, or to make the legs too long. By splitting in half, you instantly know where to place the groin and you know where to place the hands as well. The advantage of this, which we'll get more into later on when it comes to the anatomy, is that you can essentially split the body into 2 systems, into the lower half and into the upper half. And this is split off by the hips. Like here, this is basically the splitting point. And as you can see, it goes pretty much bang on when it comes to the bottom of the hips here. So this is a really, really useful way of dealing with proportion. As you can see here as well, also the hands. This is something that's really common. Either you make the hands too short. A lot of times people are going to make the hands, the wrist go here and then the hand goes here. Or they make the hand way too long and it goes all the way down here. Put the wrist basically where the groin is and you are going to be in a good spot. And the beauty of this system is that we can just keep splitting stuff into half and you're going to keep subdividing this further and further. So if we split this again in half, you're going to see that we are now hitting around the area of the nipples and also we are hitting the knees. So this becomes quite simple whenever you're creating something. Split it in half, you get the groin, split in half and you get the nipple and you get the knee. Then we can again split this in half. And this is as far as we are going to be splitting this so far. But now you can see that we have the head. And you can see the head here is now, well, 1/8, meaning this figure here is 8 heads tall. Then we split this in half again here. You can see that we are at around the belly button as well as the bottom of the ribs as well. And then the remaining ones here in the bottom is not particularly useful. This just splits the thigh in half and the shins in half as well. You could, of course, split this further into halves. This is particularly useful when it comes to the head. If you were to, for instance, split this even further, you would see that the that the eyes are pretty much bang in the middle here. So now this has been split in half, and you can keep splitting this further in half here. Now you split this in half, you can see this is where the nose is. Split this in half, you can see this is about where the lips are going to be. And then you can draw lines here, for instance. You can see this is where the ear is going to be. So there are a lot of proportional rules like this. You can split this in half. And I'm pretty much at the level here of the collarbones here. So there are a lot of things you can do here when it comes to it. But at some point as well, you reach a point where this becomes less practical, because it's not just about making a perfect system. The goal with proportions is really so that you can internalize the anatomy, so that this becomes more intuitive. So if you're, for instance, if you're creating a character, you know that, okay, the head is here, and then we can maybe split this in half, the neck goes down here, and then we have the ribs, and the ribs would go down to like this point here. Then we have, we know the hips are going down here, and we know that the knees are going to go down here to about this point here. And then we know that the feet are obviously going to go down here. So this is a very useful system for dealing with this. Same here as well when it comes to the hands as well. We know for a fact the hands are going to go about here. So there are tons of interesting points here that you can make when it comes to proportion. Another really useful measurement is going to be the width of the hips. The hips are about 2 heads wide, but this is not the height of the head. This is going to be the width of the head. So this is really useful to think about, that about 2 heads wide. And this also applies to the rib cage as well. As you can see here, this is pretty standard. This is, of course, where there is a lot of variation between people as well, because in this case, you can see that the hips are the same width as the rib cage, which is not the case for a lot of people. Still a useful general set of proportion, though. In terms of the shoulder blades, you can see there's also 1 head width here as well. So we have the shoulder blades. We haven't really talked about this yet. We will, of course, get into this, but this becomes a very important landmark for us as well. And the shoulder blades is really one of the more important parts when it comes to the just the upper body anatomy. So knowing that there is about a head width here is pretty useful. One of the reasons it's useful to deal with heads, particularly when it comes to like the width and the height, particularly like the width of here, is that we can really easily measure this. If you're making a figure and you're like drawing this kind of stuff up here, and then you're doing the scapulas later on, you can pretty easily just draw some lines here, even if they're just imaginary, and they just kind of serve as general landmarks. For instance, if you were to do this and you were to just kind of place the scapulas where you think they are, maybe they're like around here, then it's not really going to work, because now you can see that they're too far apart. Of course, this works if you're making something more stylized, but if you're creating a naturalistic human, it's very useful to have these general landmarks to go by. The hips is also one of the more important landmarks of the whole body. We will, of course, also get more in depth in this. And the hips, 1 head high as well. Really useful landmark. This is one of the practical ones. You can just take the head and you can just basically just measure it out like so. Looking at the arms, you can also see that this is also pretty universal. If you were to split the arms in half, where you start at the wrist and go up here to the shoulder, you can see that the elbow is pretty much bang in the middle. This is one of these it's true enough. This is really helpful to think about. In practice, the halfway point will go a bit down here where the fingers are going from, but it's still a really useful landmark. Just thinking about them being split in half like so. This is the case for a lot of proportions as well, where we have to utilize the correct enough principle where, yeah, this kind of stuff is not going to be 100%, but it's still useful to think about it as so, because it means that you're not going to make the arm here down like this far, or like you're not going to make the lower arms like this long, for instance, or the upper arm like this short and all that. So true enough is really useful, because you make something that is mostly true instead of like completely incorrect. It's almost like we're a bit risk averse there. We're optimizing for not making mistakes. And then you can use reference to, of course, sanity check all this. And like with the arms being split in half, you can also see the same thing with the legs as well. If you were to go up here, where this is called the greater trochanter, we'll talk a lot more about that later on, where if you basically split the legs in half, go basically at the kneecap and at the ankles, and this is pretty much 50-50. So that's it for proportion. Overall, it's important to have a decent understanding of proportion, particularly when you start to like split the character into halves, because this way you can really start to to just get like a bit of a nice sanity checker when it comes to your characters. It's not something you have to memorize like 100%. You really just have to get started with creating art. But the more you use this system, the more internalized it's going to be, and the less you have to really think about it. But some of the more important ones is just split the body in two. Down